A Syrian pilot flying at the edge of space feels the absolute confidence of a man encased in a legend. The year is 1981 and the machine surrounding him is the MiG-25 Foxbat, an aircraft feared by the West as an untouchable titan of the skies. But the legend is a lie, a carefully constructed myth of Soviet power, and in the next 30 seconds, that myth is about to be shattered by an enemy the pilot will never even see. The date is February 13th, 1981. The place is 28,000 feet above the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon. Through the wide, curved canopy of his MiG-25 Foxbat, a Syrian Air Force pilot scans the horizon with a sense of absolute and unshakable confidence. The most advanced and feared interceptor in the entire Soviet arsenal surrounds him, a machine capable of flying at more than 3 times the speed of sound, a fighter that Western intelligence has regarded with a kind of paranoid awe for 15 years. Below him, he knows Israeli F-15 Eagles are prowling the Lebanese sky. But the Syrian pilot feels no real concern. The Soviet instructors who had trained him, both in his home country and in the grey cold skies of the Soviet Union, had drilled one central and unwavering certainty into the mind of every Foxbat pilot. Nothing could catch you. Nothing could outrun you. The MiG-25 was, in a word, untouchable. His radar warning receiver, the electronic ears that should alert him to an enemy's presence, remains stubbornly, reassuringly silent as he positions his aircraft for an attack run. He has been taught to revere the Foxbat, to see it as the very pinnacle of Soviet aviation engineering. His instructors spoke of it with a tone bordering on worship. They called it a titanium demon, a machine so powerful and so advanced that it made the West's best fighters obsolete before they even left the drawing board. It could climb to 80,000 feet, cruise at nearly 3 times the speed of sound, and carry massive, powerful missiles that no enemy could possibly evade. What this Syrian pilot does not know, what no Soviet instructor had ever told him, is that everything he believes about his magnificent aircraft is about to be proven catastrophically and fatally wrong. Within just a few seconds, an American-designed fighter will destroy his MiG-25 in a manner that the Soviet Union's own aviation engineers had long ago declared to be a tactical impossibility. The engagement will last for less than 30 seconds. The myth of Soviet interceptor supremacy, a myth that had shaped the strategic calculations of the Cold War for more than a decade, will die even faster. The story of the MiG-25 Foxbat begins, as so many Cold War stories do, with a deep and abiding paranoia. In the early 1960s, the United States unveiled the XB-70 Valkyrie, a stunning and futuristic strategic bomber designed to penetrate Soviet airspace at 70,000 feet and at 3 times the speed of sound. For the commanders of the Soviet Air Defense Forces, who had already been humiliated by 4 years of unstoppable U-2 spy plane overflights, the Valkyrie was an existential threat. They demanded an interceptor that was capable of flying high enough and fast enough to destroy these new, high-altitude threats. The Mikoyan-Gurevich Design Bureau, one of the crown jewels of the Soviet aviation industry, responded with the prototype of what would become the MiG-25. The chief designer, Mikhail Gurevich, was faced with an almost impossible set of specifications. The new aircraft needed to reach Mach 3, climb to 80,000 feet, and carry a payload of heavy air-to-air missiles. But the Soviet Union of the 1960s was a place of immense industrial might, but also of significant technological limitations. They had no engine that could provide the necessary thrust without melting, and titanium, the logical and necessary material for building a Mach 3 airframe, was incredibly scarce, expensive, and difficult to work with. Every design choice became a painful compromise between the dream of ultimate capability and the harsh, unforgiving reality of their industrial capacity. The solution that Gurevich and his team came up with was a masterpiece of brutalist, pragmatic engineering, and it was a solution that would shock Western intelligence when it was finally revealed years later. The MiG-25's primary structure was not made of titanium, but of a heavy nickel-steel alloy. Steel was cheap, it was abundant, and it could be easily welded by semi-skilled workers in the vast factories of the Soviet Union. The aircraft that resulted from this choice was a monster. It weighed approximately 81,000 pounds when fully loaded, making it one of the heaviest single-seat fighters ever built. But what it lacked in elegance, it made up for in raw, unadulterated power. Its two massive Tumansky R-15 engines were essentially modified cruise missile power plants, each one producing a staggering 2,500 pounds of thrust at maximum afterburner. The first production MiG-25P interceptors entered service with the Soviet Air Defense Forces in 1970. NATO assigned it the reporting name Foxbat and immediately designated it a critical frontline threat. Western intelligence analysts observing the massive twin-tailed fighter at Soviet air shows made a series of assumptions based on its appearance and its carefully managed performance demonstrations. Those assumptions, it would turn out, were almost completely wrong. Knowing that the aircraft could exceed Mach 3, they concluded that it must be constructed primarily of titanium, like the American SR-71 Blackbird. Observing its enormous size, they assumed that it must carry a suite of sophisticated avionics and a powerful long-range radar, and watching it climb at a spectacular, near-vertical angle during airshow performances, they calculated that it must possess an extraordinary degree of maneuverability. The intelligence estimates that were circulated at the highest levels of the Pentagon and NATO credited the Foxbat with a set of capabilities that existed only in the fertile imaginations of the Western analysts and in the deliberately deceptive pages of Soviet propaganda. The myth of the titanium demon had been born. While the West was building a myth around the MiG-25, the men who actually flew the aircraft were living a very different and far less glamorous reality. For the Soviet pilots assigned to the Foxbat squadrons, the vast gulf between the official propaganda and the machine's true capabilities was a daily and often terrifying fact of life. This truth, however, was a secret they could never speak aloud. When a test pilot, Alexander Fedotov, flew the prototype for the first time on March 6, 1964, the aircraft climbed like a rocket, pinning him to his seat with its raw power. But in his carefully worded official report, he noted that it handled with certain unique characteristics. Among the community of Soviet test pilots, an unofficial and far more direct description was developed. The MiG-25, they would whisper to each other in private, flew like a freight train on rails. It could not turn, it could not maneuver, it could only go straight, and it could only go blindingly fast. But in the strategic calculus of the 1960s, the Soviet Union did not believe it needed a nimble dogfighter. It needed a pure, single-purpose interceptor, a weapon designed to scream into the stratosphere, to destroy the incoming American bombers before they could deliver their nuclear weapons, and to return to base. For this specific mission, the MiG-25's severe limitations did not seem to matter. Speed and altitude were everything. Maneuverability was considered an irrelevant luxury in a fight against a bomber that would be flying straight and level. One of the men who came to know the truth of the Foxbat intimately was a young and ambitious pilot named Lieutenant Viktor Ivanovich Belenko. Assigned to the 513th Fighter Regiment in the cold, desolate landscape of Siberia, Belenko flew the MiG-25P interceptor variant from 1971 onward. His experience with the aircraft slowly, painstakingly revealed the immense gap between the legend and the reality. The cockpit instrumentation, he discovered, was shockingly primitive. It looked like it belonged in a 1940s-era bomber, not a frontline supersonic interceptor. The equipment bays were filled with bulky and antiquated vacuum tube electronics, a technology that Western fighter jets had abandoned almost 20 years earlier. The radar, designated the RP-25 Smerche, was supposedly the most powerful airborne radar in the world. In reality, it was a clumsy and unreliable beast. It had immense power, but it could barely distinguish the ground clutter from a low-flying aircraft, and it was notoriously easy to jam. The hydraulic systems, which were needed to move the aircraft's massive control surfaces, leaked constantly, the red fluid a common sight on the tarmac beneath the jets. The fuel system was a nightmare, burning through kerosene at such a prodigious rate that the aircraft's endurance at maximum afterburner was measured in a handful of terrifyingly short minutes. But most critically, the flight control system itself made any kind of sustained, aggressive maneuvering a physical impossibility. At high speeds, the control stick would become nearly immovable, requiring the pilot to use both hands and his entire body weight to execute even a gentle turn. If a pilot pulled too hard on the stick, if he tried to force the aircraft into a turn that its designers had not intended, the massive steel structure of the airframe itself would permanently deform. The Soviet flight manuals were filled with stark and absolute warnings. The absolute maximum G-load was a mere 2.2 Gs at speeds above Mach 2.8 and a still meager 4.5 Gs at lower speeds. For comparison, the American fighters of the same era were being designed to withstand 7 or 8 Gs as a matter of routine. Any combat that required sharp turns or aggressive high-G maneuvering was simply beyond the MiG-25's physical and structural capability. Belenko and his fellow pilots would discuss these severe limitations in private, in hushed whispers in the corners of the ready room, but never in writing and never in front of a political officer. To criticize a piece of Soviet aviation technology, to question the wisdom of the state's own engineers, was a career-ending and potentially life-altering act of disloyalty. But as the years went on, Viktor Belenko began to question everything. He questioned his service, he questioned his aircraft, and he began to question the entire, vast, and seemingly monolithic system that had produced them both. He was a man sitting in the cockpit of a propaganda creation, a machine that was disguised as the world's greatest fighter, and the weight of that lie was beginning to become unbearable. The freight train, he realized, was on a track that led nowhere. While Soviet pilots were struggling with the crude realities of their propaganda machine, American engineers were in the process of building something entirely different. They were building a weapon born not from a single, narrow paranoia, but from the hard and bloody lessons of a real war. They were building the F-15 Eagle. The F-15 emerged from the profound and painful reassessment that the United States Air Force underwent in the wake of the Vietnam War. In the skies over Southeast Asia, American fighters, which had been designed around the central concept of a high-altitude nuclear attack mission, had struggled mightily against the small, nimble, and Soviet-built MiGs flown by the North Vietnamese. The American pilots, flying large and complex aircraft like the F-4 Phantom, found themselves drawn into close-quarters dogfights for which they were neither trained nor equipped. The experience was a brutal education. In 1965, chastened by these lessons, the US Air Force issued a new set of requirements for an entirely new kind of aircraft. They did not want another multi-role compromise design. They wanted a pure, thoroughbred air superiority fighter, a machine that was optimized for one single, overriding purpose: to seek out and to destroy enemy aircraft anywhere, at any time, and under any conditions. The contract was won by McDonnell Douglas, and their design was guided by a radical and almost unheard-of philosophy. The F-15 Eagle would not compromise. It would be the absolute best air-to-air fighter that American technology could possibly produce, regardless of its cost or its complexity. The chief engineer, a man named Dave Lewis, assembled a team of the brightest young designers in the country, and they pursued this goal of ultimate performance with an almost religious dedication. They wanted everything. They wanted blistering speed, a phenomenal rate of climb, neck-snapping acceleration, and the ability to turn and maneuver in a way that would defy the known laws of aerodynamics. But they also wanted long range, a massive weapons capacity, and a suite of advanced electronics that would make the pilot the single most informed and most lethal combatant in the sky. The F-15 that first flew on July 27, 1972, was the stunning result of this ambitious vision. It was, in every sense, American engineering at its most ambitious and its most uncompromising. Its two Pratt & Whitney F-100 turbofan engines produced a combined total of approximately 47,060 pounds of thrust, enough power to accelerate the 44,000-pound fighter straight up, vertically like a rocket. Its massive, blended wing design gave it a remarkably low wing loading, just 54 pounds per square foot, which allowed it to perform sustained 9G turns at combat weight, a level of maneuverability that was, at the time, simply unheard of for an aircraft of its size. Its Hughes APG-63 radar was a masterpiece of solid-state electronics, a look-down, shoot-down system that could track multiple low-flying targets simultaneously at ranges exceeding 100 miles. But it was the F-15's flight control system that truly set it apart from anything that had come before it. A set of powerful, hydraulically boosted controls gave the pilot a complete and effortless authority over the aircraft, at any speed and at any altitude. A sophisticated electronic stability augmentation system worked in the background, constantly making tiny adjustments, preventing the aircraft from ever departing from controlled flight. The pilot could, for the first time, maneuver his aircraft to the absolute limits of his own physical endurance, yanking it through 9G turns from sea level to 60,000 feet without any fear of losing control of the machine. American test pilots, who were accustomed to the careful, delicate handling required by older fighters, discovered an aircraft that seemed to respond instantly, not to their physical inputs but to their very thoughts. The early test results shocked even the Air Force generals who had commissioned the plane. In 1973, a test pilot named Irv Burroughs demonstrated the aircraft's incredible performance, holding it in a sustained 9G turn at 30,000 feet. The F-15 could accelerate from just under the speed of sound to Mach 2.3 in less than 2 minutes. Its zoom climbs could reach altitudes of over 65,000 feet. This was an aircraft that could dogfight, it could run, it could climb, or it could dive, all with an equal and terrifying effectiveness. The Soviet intelligence services observed the F-15's development with a growing sense of concern. The reports that were coming back from their agents in America described a level of performance that seemed to be a physical impossibility. Their own engineers, analyzing the available data, concluded that the Americans must be exaggerating. No single fighter, they argued, could simultaneously optimize for speed, for agility, and for combat persistence. The laws of physics, as they understood them, made such a performance impossible. But the F-15 was real, and it was about to be introduced to the one American ally that was most eager and most able to use it. While the Israeli Air Force was beginning to master its new and uncompromising weapon, a quiet drama of conscience and disillusionment was reaching its breaking point in the cold, desolate landscape of Siberia. Lieutenant Viktor Belenko, the MiG-25 pilot who had come to see the vast gulf between the propaganda and the reality of his aircraft, had made a decision. He would escape. On September 6, 1976, the 30-year-old Belenko, now completely disillusioned with the corruption and the lies of Soviet life, executed what would become the single most damaging defection in the history of Cold War aviation. He departed from his airbase at Chuguyevka as part of a routine training flight, flying in a formation with several other pilots from his regiment. At first, to avoid revealing his intentions, Belenko followed the standard flight plan with a meticulous and professional precision. He performed the required maneuvers, he maintained his position in the formation, and he responded to the commands from ground control. Then at the far end of the designated training circuit, at the moment when he was supposed to turn back towards his base, he did not. Instead, he continued flying eastward and then put his massive, heavy fighter into a steep, rapid descent. He leveled off just 100 feet above the grey, choppy waters of the Sea of Japan, flying so low that he disappeared from the coverage of the Soviet and Japanese radar networks. The MiG-25, a high-altitude thoroughbred, was never designed for this kind of low-level flight. At this height, in the thick, dense air, its fuel consumption increased dramatically. Belenko knew he was in a desperate race against time. In a final act of defiance and foresight, he had brought the aircraft's thick, classified technical manual with him, a document that was strictly forbidden on any operational flight. He knew that the American engineers who would eventually get their hands on his plane would need it to truly understand the machine. His squadron mates, realizing that something was terribly wrong, began to pursue him. But the MiG-25's own severe limitations now worked in Belenko's favor. The heavy, unmaneuverable fighter could not turn or handle well at low altitude. His pursuers, struggling with their own clumsy aircraft, could not catch him before he crossed the invisible line into Japanese airspace. As he approached the coast of Japan, Belenko began a series of pop-up climbs, briefly ascending to a higher altitude to reveal himself on the Japanese radar screens. He was trying to signal his presence to ensure that he would not be mistaken for a hostile intruder and shot down, but the poor weather and the limitations of the Japanese Air Self-Defense Force's own F-4E Phantoms prevented them from locating Belenko and providing him with an escort. He had originally planned to land at Chitose Air Base, the only military airfield that was shown on his limited map of the area, but the bad weather and his critically low fuel state forced him to divert to the nearest available runway, the civilian airport at Hakodate. He circled the field 3 times, his jet now running on fumes, and on his final approach he nearly collided with a departing Boeing 727 airliner. The Hakodate runway, at just 6,500 feet, was dangerously short for a massive, high-speed interceptor like the MiG-25. Despite deploying his drag parachute and applying the maximum braking force, the aircraft overran the runway by nearly 800 feet, finally coming to a stop in the soft earth just short of a major road. When the stunned Japanese police arrived at the scene at 14:10 in the afternoon, they found Viktor Belenko climbing down from the cockpit of his incredible, alien-looking machine. He had just 30 seconds of fuel remaining. When he was questioned, he stated clearly, in broken English, that he wanted political asylum in the United States. The Japanese, shocked to see a front-line Soviet interceptor sitting at the end of their civilian airport, immediately contacted the American authorities. The Soviet Union, in a furious diplomatic protest, demanded the immediate return of Belenko and the repatriation of his aircraft. Soviet embassy officials were allowed to meet with Belenko on September 9th in a desperate attempt to persuade him to return. He refused categorically. President Gerald Ford granted him political asylum, and he was flown to the United States on September 10th. But the MiG-25, the real prize, remained in Japan. The Soviets mounted an intense and sustained campaign of diplomatic pressure for its return, but the Japanese and American engineers needed time. The aircraft was too large to be moved by any of the Japanese transport planes. On September 25th, it was partially disassembled and loaded under the cover of darkness onto a massive United States Air Force C-5A Galaxy cargo transport. A banner hung on the side of the aircraft by the American crew read in Japanese, "Goodbye, people of Hakodate. Sorry for the trouble." Within hours, the Foxbat was at a secure airbase north of Tokyo, and a team of the top American aviation intelligence specialists were descending upon it, their tools and their cameras ready. The unmasking of the titanium demon was about to begin. In the secure, brightly lit hangar at Hyakuri Air Base, the American intelligence teams began their meticulous, almost reverential, examination of the MiG-25. For the first time, they were able to see, to touch, and to dissect the machine that had haunted their threat assessments for over a decade. What they discovered, piece by painstaking piece, would not just revise their understanding of Soviet aviation, it would completely and utterly transform it. The myth of the Foxbat was about to be systematically and brutally unmasked. The first and most immediate shock was the aircraft's construction. It was, to the American engineers who were accustomed to the finely milled precision of their own aircraft, crude beyond all belief. The fuselage was not a sleek, sculpted shell of exotic alloys, but a patchwork of 18-gauge nickel-steel sheets welded together by hand, with visible and often irregular seams. Rivets, which create drag and disrupt airflow, protruded from the skin in a way that would have been unacceptable on any Western high-performance aircraft. The cockpit instrumentation, which they had assumed would be a marvel of advanced Soviet electronics, looked antiquated. It was a cluttered collection of old-fashioned mechanical gauges and vacuum tubes, a level of technology that Western fighters had abandoned in the 1950s. But the greatest revelation of all came from the materials analysis. For years, American engineers, knowing the aircraft's speed, had assumed that the MiG-25 must be constructed primarily of titanium, the only material they knew of that could withstand the intense heat of a sustained Mach 3 flight. Instead, they found that the aircraft was almost entirely made of nickel-steel alloy, a material that had been chosen not for its performance, but for its cheapness and its ease of manufacture. The Foxbat was not a technological marvel. It was an industrial compromise, a machine designed to be mass-produced by a workforce with minimal skills, using readily available materials. The analysis of the flight control system revealed even more disturbing limitations. American test pilots, reviewing the data on the incredible control forces required to maneuver the aircraft at high speeds, concluded that combat maneuvering was, for all practical purposes, essentially impossible. The pilot would need a level of superhuman strength to pull more than a 3G turn at speeds above Mach 2.5. The structural analysis of the airframe confirmed that the load limits were far, far below the standards of any American fighter. The MiG-25 was, as its own pilots had whispered, a one-trick pony. It was blindingly fast in a straight line, but it was utterly incapable of fighting. While the American and Japanese engineers continued their evaluation for a full 67 days, the Soviet embassy in Tokyo desperately and furiously demanded the aircraft's immediate return. But it was too late. The American engineers had photographed every single component, they had measured every dimension, and they had tested every system. They had discovered the vacuum tubes that had been obsolete in the West for 20 years, the radar components that belonged in a museum display, and the hydraulic pumps that leaked continuously. Nothing remained a secret. The Central Intelligence Agency issued a new, top-secret assessment of the Soviet air threat that fundamentally rewrote the strategic calculus of the Cold War. The MiG-25 was not the technological leap forward that Western intelligence had feared for so long. It was a paper tiger, a niche aircraft that had been designed to destroy one specific and very narrow threat, the American B-70 bomber, and that threat no longer existed. The United States had cancelled the B-70 program back in 1969 after building only 2 prototypes. The Soviets had built hundreds of their premier interceptors to counter a bomber that America had never even deployed. The Soviet humiliation was made complete when Viktor Belenko, now granted asylum and living in the United States, began to provide his own detailed and devastating testimony. He described the MiG-25's incredibly inefficient fuel systems, which meant that its combat air patrol time was measured in a handful of minutes. He revealed that the engines required a complete and costly overhaul every 150 hours because they operated at temperatures that would constantly degrade the metals. And he explained that the massive, powerful radar could barely see a fighter-sized target beyond 50 kilometers, a small fraction of the range of its Western counterparts. But Belenko's most damaging assessment was of the quality of the Soviet pilots themselves. Their training, he revealed, was minimal. Their flight time was severely restricted because of the constant fuel shortages and the endless maintenance problems. The pilots were given only limited and often misleading information about their own aircraft's capabilities and its profound limitations. Soviet aviation, he explained, was a system that was built on a philosophy of quantity, not quality. It was a system that was willing to accept a poor level of performance because producing thousands of mediocre aircraft was considered to be cheaper and more strategically sound than producing a few hundred excellent ones. The myth of the invincible Foxbat, a myth that had been so carefully constructed by Soviet propaganda and so eagerly inflated by the West's own worst fears, had been completely and utterly destroyed by the actions of one disgruntled pilot and by 67 days of meticulous American analysis. The paper tiger had been unmasked. The complete and unvarnished truth about the MiG-25, delivered by the defection of Viktor Belenko, was an intelligence windfall of the highest order for the West. For the Israeli Air Force, it was more than just a confirmation of their own growing suspicions. It was a practical, tactical roadmap to victory. The complete American assessment of the Foxbat, including its technical specifications, its performance limitations, and Belenko's own invaluable insights, was immediately shared with Israeli intelligence. As the Israeli Air Force planners studied the new data, they realized that the MiG-25, the aircraft that had been the bogeyman of their nightmares, was, in fact, uniquely and exquisitely vulnerable to the one aircraft in their inventory that had been designed to be its perfect antithesis, the F-15 Eagle. The Foxbat's inability to maneuver meant that it could not effectively evade an incoming missile. Its antiquated short-range radar meant that it could not detect a threat until it was already too late. And its severely limited fuel capacity meant that any kind of extended, high-performance combat was an impossibility. The supposedly unstoppable interceptor could be destroyed, they concluded, if it was engaged properly. The opportunity to test this new theory came on February 13, 1981. For months, the Syrian Air Force had been flying MiG-25 reconnaissance variants on provocative, high-altitude, high-speed overflights of Israeli positions in Lebanon. These flights, which were conducted with a kind of arrogant impunity, were a constant and irritating reminder of a perceived Soviet technological superiority. The Israeli fighters and the ground-based missiles of the time were simply unable to reach them. The Israeli Air Force decided that it was time to end these flights permanently. They began to position their new F-15 patrols at specific altitudes and in specific locations, creating a carefully planned aerial ambush designed to intercept the high-flying Foxbats. The Syrian pilot who flew that mission on February 13th was supremely confident in his MiG-25's reputation. He never saw his killers. The Israeli F-15 pilot, Benny Zinker, the commanding officer of the IAF's 133rd Squadron, was flying at 30,000 feet, his powerful radar scanning the high-altitude corridors, when he acquired the Foxbat at a range of 90 kilometers. The Syrian pilot, relying on the Soviet assurances of his aircraft's invincibility, was flying a straight and level course at a speed of Mach 2.3, exactly as the Soviet doctrine prescribed. Zinker, following the new Israeli tactics that had been developed specifically for this engagement, positioned his F-15 below and behind the Syrian fighter. The Hughes APG-63 radar in his Eagle maintained a perfect solid track, despite the target's incredible speed. At a range of 35 kilometers, still well beyond the Syrian pilot's own radar detection capability, Zinker fired two AM-7 Sparrow radar-guided missiles. The missiles, accelerating to over Mach 3.5, closed the distance to the supersonic target in a matter of seconds. The Syrian pilot's radar warning receiver, which was designed to detect threats from ahead, never gave him any indication of the danger that was rapidly approaching from his 6 o'clock position. The first Sparrow's proximity fuse detonated just 20 feet from the MiG-25's left engine. The shrapnel from its continuous rod warhead shredded the engine and punctured the fuel tanks. The second missile, which had been launched as insurance, passed through the expanding debris cloud and detonated near the cockpit. The MiG-25, which was traveling at over 1,750 miles per hour at the moment of impact, began to tumble violently out of control. The heavy steel structure of the aircraft, which had never been designed for this kind of violent, uncontrolled maneuvering, began to twist and tear itself apart under the immense aerodynamic loads. Pieces of the tail section separated. The canopy, which had already been cracked by the overpressure of the explosions, was blown away completely. The Syrian pilot, if he had even survived the initial blasts, now faced an impossible situation. Ejecting from a tumbling aircraft at Mach 2.3 was far beyond the design limits of his ejection seat. The Israeli ground radars tracked the flaming wreckage as it fell towards Lebanese territory. The entire engagement from the first radar contact to the complete destruction of the aircraft had lasted just 37 seconds. The first ever combat kill of a MiG-25 Foxbat had been accomplished without the Israeli pilot ever having to enter visual range. The Soviet instructors had trained the Syrian pilots that nothing could catch a Foxbat at high altitude and high speed. They had been catastrophically and fatally wrong. The myth had been killed. The successful destruction of the Syrian MiG-25 was more than just a single tactical victory. It was a profound psychological blow. The Soviet Union immediately dispatched a team of its top technical investigators to Syria to interview the surviving Syrian Air Force pilots and to recover whatever wreckage they could from the crash site. The engineers from the Mikoyan Design Bureau needed to understand how an F-15 had managed to kill a Mach 3 interceptor. The Syrian pilots, shaken by the loss, provided details that the Soviet analysts found deeply disturbing. The F-15 had not pursued the MiG-25 in a high-speed chase, as the Soviet doctrine had always assumed would be necessary. Instead, the American-designed fighter had used its sophisticated long-range radar to track the target from a position of near invisibility and had launched its missiles from well beyond visual range. The engagement had required no maneuvering, no high-speed pursuit, and no dramatic, close-in dogfight. The F-15 pilot had simply detected, tracked, fired, and confirmed the kill, a clinical and almost bloodless procedure. The Soviet engineers analyzing the engagement parameters realized that their entire air combat doctrine was fundamentally flawed. The MiG-25's design was based on the assumption that it would always detect any threat first, allowing it to either engage or to escape, using its superior speed. But the American radars could detect targets at ranges where the Foxbat's own, antiquated radar saw nothing but electronic noise. And the American missiles could hit Mach 3 targets that the Soviets had believed were untouchable. The confidence of the Soviet air power establishment had been deeply and perhaps irrevocably shaken. The final, brutal, and public verdict on this new reality was delivered just 16 months later in the skies over Lebanon's Bekaa Valley. On June 9, 1982, the Israeli Air Force launched Operation Mole Cricket 19, a massive and brilliantly executed airstrike designed to destroy the dense network of Syrian surface-to-air missile batteries that had been installed in the valley. In less than 2 hours, Israeli F-15s, F-16s, and a host of electronic warfare aircraft destroyed all 19 of the Soviet-built SAM batteries without losing a single aircraft. The Syrian Air Force, including its MiG-23s, MiG-21s, and its remaining MiG-25s, scrambled from their bases around Damascus to engage the Israeli attackers. The Syrian pilots, trained by Soviet instructors and using Soviet doctrine, flew in the massed, rigid formations that were designed for mutual support. They expected that their numerical superiority and their coordinated tactics would be enough to overwhelm any Israeli technological advantages, but June 9th exposed the complete and catastrophic failure of that doctrine. The Syrian pilots discovered that their numerical advantage meant nothing in the face of an absolute technological dominance. The Israeli F-15 pilots, with their APG-63 radars tracking multiple targets simultaneously, could engage the Syrian formations before the Syrian pilots even knew that the combat had begun. They saw their squadron mates exploding in fireballs around them without ever detecting the missiles that had killed them. By the end of that single devastating day, the Israeli forces had shot down 82 Syrian aircraft, including a number of the once feared MiG-25s. Israel had lost 0 aircraft in air-to-air combat. The kill ratio, 82 to nothing, represented the most one-sided air battle of the entire jet age. The Soviet advisors who were observing the battle from their command posts in Damascus could not explain how their carefully trained Syrian pilots, flying their most advanced exported fighters, had been slaughtered so completely. Marshal Pavel Kutakov, the commander-in-chief of the Soviet Air Forces, personally traveled to Syria to investigate the disaster. His final secret report to the Soviet Defense Ministry, which was partially revealed after the collapse of the Soviet Union, concluded that the Western air combat technology had achieved a level of superiority that the Soviet systems simply could not counter. The entire foundation of Soviet air combat theory, which was built on the concepts of numerical superiority and a willingness to accept high loss rates, was now obsolete. The myth of the MiG-25, which had begun to die over the Bekaa Valley in February of 1981, was now buried once and for all under a mountain of Syrian wreckage. The final statistics from the F-15's long and storied career would tell the complete story. In American and Israeli service, the F-15 Eagle would achieve 104 confirmed air-to-air victories, with 0 losses to enemy fighters. The unstoppable interceptor, the titanium demon of the West's imagination, had been proven to be nothing more than a ghost, a paper tiger that had been created by propaganda and had been destroyed by reality